rugs, the scent of lilies always reminded me of death. They were expensive, white, and suffocating, filling every corridor of the Everhart mansion like a funeral shroud that never quite left. For 3 years, I had lived in a house that was a masterpiece of architecture and a wasteland of affection. I remember the way my father used to smell sandalwood and old books. He had been a gentleman, a rarity for an alpha of his standing, and he had loved me with a quiet intensity that I thought would protect me forever. But when he died, the light in the mansion didn't just dim, it was extinguished. The mystery of his passing remained a cold stone in my chest, a question no one would answer, and the void he left was quickly filled by Vivienne. My stepmother did not believe in gentleness. To Vivienne, love was a currency, and I was a bankrupt asset. Still daydreaming, Kael? The voice was like a razor blade wrapped in silk. I flinched, my shoulders hunching instinctively as I looked up from the floor I had been scrubbing. Vivienne stood over me, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. Beside her, Elliot, my stepbrother, and a fellow amiga looked at me with a smirk of pure contentment. Elliot was everything I was not: adored, spoiled, and cruel. He wore silks that cost more than the meager allowance I was permitted, while my clothes were faded and oversized. "I'm sorry, stepmother," I whispered, my voice raspy from hours of silence. "Don't apologize, just be useful," she sneered, glancing at me as if I were a stain on the rug. "The guests arrive in 2 days. I expect the West Wing to be spotless. If I find a single speck of dust, you'll spend the night in the cellar." I didn't argue. I had learned long ago that words were weapons used against me. I simply bowed my head, the silver-black strands of my hair falling over my gray eyes, and returned to my work. I was 19, an amiga born into one of the wealthiest families in the empire, yet I lived as a ghost in my own home. I was the servant, the scapegoat, the unwanted remnant of a dead man's heart. I spent my days in a blur of exhaustion and loneliness, clinging to a flickering hope that perhaps, if I were perfect enough, Vivienne would see me as a son. But hope is a dangerous thing for someone in my position. It blinds you to the predators until their teeth are already in your skin. The truth came on a rainy Tuesday evening. I had been sent to the study to deliver tea, but as I approached the heavy mahogany doors, I heard voices. Vivienne was speaking, her tone devoid of its usual performative sweetness. It was cold, transactional, and terrifying. "He is young, healthy, and possesses the Everhart bloodline," Vivienne was saying. "He will be an obedient spouse. He has been broken for years, he won't put up a fight." "And the price?" A man's voice responded, a gravelly, ancient sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. "My debts are substantial, Magnus. The gambling, the failed ventures in the South. I need the full sum by the end of the week. In exchange, the boy is yours. He is an omega of high quality, despite his temperament." I froze, the tea tray trembling in my hands. Magnus Hale. The name sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. He was a tycoon, yes, but he was a monster. The rumors about him were whispered in the dark corners of high society, stories of previous amiga spouses who had entered his estate vibrant and left it as hollow shells, or didn't leave at all. He was 60 years old, a man who bought people to break them. "A fair trade," Magnus replied. "I've always preferred them young. I shall arrive on Friday to collect my prize." "You should feel grateful, Kael." Vivienne's voice suddenly shifted. Though she was still behind the door, I realized she knew I was there. She had known the whole time. "At least an omega like you still has value." I didn't stay to hear the rest. I turned and bolted, the tray crashing to the floor, porcelain shattering like my life. I ran to my small, drafty room in the attic and locked the door, collapsing against the wood. That night, the nightmare returned. It was a recurring vision, one I had dismissed as stress for months. But now it felt like a prophecy. I saw myself in a room of gold and mirrors, draped in heavy jewelry that felt like chains. I saw a man with cold, dead eyes towering over me. I felt the phantom pain of bruises on my wrist and the crushing weight of a pregnancy that felt more like a parasite than a child. In the dream, I was carrying Magnus Hale's heir, wasting away in a gilded prison until I finally closed my eyes for the last time. Abandoned and forgotten in a house that smelled of lilies and rot. I woke up screaming, my skin drenched in cold sweat, my scent of snow, jasmine, and vanilla spiked with the sharp, acrid tang of terror. I looked at the clock. It was midnight. Friday was coming. For the first time in my life, the fear was outweighed by a sudden, violent spark of defiance. I had spent years believing that if I endured the pain, the world would eventually be kind. But the world wasn't kind. It was a marketplace, and I was being sold. I would not be a prize. I would not be a ghost. With trembling hands, I reached under my loose floorboard and pulled out a small tin. Inside was a modest sum of cash I had managed to steal in small increments over the last year, money I had hoped to use one day to buy a book or a warm coat. Beside it lay a set of fake identification papers I had bought from a desperate contact in the city months ago, a paranoid precaution I had hoped I'd never need. I packed a small bag with a few belongings that truly belonged to me, a photograph of my father, a heavy sweater, and a piece of bread. The house was silent, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof. I crept through the corridors, avoiding the guards and the cameras, knowing the layout of the mansion better than anyone because I was the one who cleaned it. As I reached the servants' entrance, I paused and looked back at the opulent staircase. This place had been my home, then my prison, and now it was nothing but a graveyard of my childhood. I stepped out into the cold, rainy night and didn't look back. I had no plan, no destination, and no one in the world who wanted me. But as the iron gates of the Everhart estate vanished into the mist behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. I felt the terrifying, exhilarating taste of freedom. The journey from the capital to the northern military district was a blur of gray skies, rattling train cars, and a gnawing, hollow hunger that felt like a living thing inside my stomach. I spent 3 days traveling, moving from one overcrowded carriage to another, clutching my small bag to my chest as if it were the only thing keeping me anchored to the earth. Every time a door opened or a stranger looked at me for too long, my heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I was certain that at any moment, Vivienne's men would step through the crowd, seize my arm, and drag me back to the mansion to be delivered to Magnus Hale. I learned how to hide. I learned to curl my body into the smallest possible ball, to pull my oversized sweater over my nose to muffle my scent, and to keep my eyes fixed on the floor. The scent of snow, jasmine, and vanilla, which had once been a source of quiet pride, now felt like a beacon for predators. I prayed that the smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies in the lower-class carriages would mask me. By the time I stepped off the train in the military city of Oakhaven, I was shivering violently. The air here didn't just feel cold, it felt aggressive. It was a biting, crystalline wind that swept down from the peaks of the border mountains, cutting through my thin clothes and settling deep into my marrow. Oakhaven was nothing like the capital. There were no gilded boulevards or manicured gardens here. The city was built of heavy stone and reinforced steel, designed for utility and defense rather than beauty. Great walls loomed over the streets, and the rhythmic sound of marching boots echoed through the plazas. Alphas dominated the landscape, soldiers in charcoal gray uniforms, their sense a chaotic mixture of leather, gunpowder, and aggression. I felt smaller than I ever had in the Everhart mansion. Here, I wasn't a fallen noble. I was simply a stray amiga in a city of wolves. For a week, I lived on the fringes of the city. I slept in a derelict boarding house where the walls leaked and the blankets smelled of mildew. I spent my days searching for work, but who would hire an amiga with fake papers and trembling hands? I survived on scraps of bread and watered-down soup, my ribs beginning to protrude, my skin turning a ghostly, translucent pale. The desperation grew until it became a fever. I had heard rumors of an amiga shelter place run by a charitable collective that provided sanctuary for those fleeing abusive households. It was my only hope. If I could get inside, perhaps I could find a way to disappear completely, or find a job that wouldn't leave me exposed to the streets. The shelter was located in a narrow alleyway in the lower district, a modest building sandwiched between a munitions warehouse and a blackened smithy. As I approached the entrance, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the cobblestones. I was halfway to the door when the world collapsed. A hand, rough and smelling of stale tobacco, clamped over my mouth, pulling me backward with violent force. I let out a muffled scream, my heels scraping against the stone as I was dragged into the darkness of a recessed doorway. "Well, look at this," a voice hissed in my ear. "A little silver-haired stray. You're too pretty to be wandering around Oakhaven alone." I thrashed, kicking wildly, but I was malnourished and weak. 2 other men emerged from the shadows, their eyes glinting with a predatory hunger that I recognized all too well. They weren't soldiers, they were traffickers, the kind of men who hunted the vulnerable to sell them to the highest bidder in the underground markets. "He's a high-grade amiga," one of them muttered, gripping my wrist so hard I knew it would bruise. "Look at that skin. He'll fetch a fortune in the South." Panic, cold and absolute, surged through me. The trauma of the past few years rushed back, the image of Magnus Hale, the gilded prison, the feeling of being property. I couldn't go back. I would rather die in this alley than be sold again. I fought with a sudden, manic strength, biting the hand that covered my mouth. The man yelled, releasing me for a split second. I scrambled backward, tripping over a pile of crates, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "You little brat," the man roared, lunging forward to grab my hair. I looked around wildly, searching for any escape, any weapon. That was when I saw him. Standing a few yards away, framed by the orange glow of a street lamp, was a man. He was towering, his silhouette cutting a sharp, imposing figure against the twilight. He wore a long, black military coat that billowed slightly in the wind, and his presence was so overwhelming that it felt like the air around him had thickened. Even from a distance, I could smell him cedarwood and smoke, a scent that was both grounding and terrifyingly powerful. He wasn't moving. He was simply watching, his golden eyes sharp and piercing, observing the scene with a cold, detached curiosity. The traffickers didn't seem to realize who he was at first. Or perhaps they were blinded by their greed. They stepped toward me again, their faces twisted in malice. In a moment of pure, impulsive desperation, I did the only thing I could think of to change the dynamic. I didn't scream for help. I didn't beg. Instead, I looked at the imposing man in the black coat and shrieked with everything I had left. "Help me. He's my husband." The silence that followed was absolute. The traffickers froze. The man in the black coat paused, his head tilting slightly to the side. He slowly turned his gaze toward me, his golden eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" he asked. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in my chest, sounding like distant thunder. The traffickers looked between us, confused. "Husband, this brat doesn't have a..." Before the man could finish his sentence, the stranger moved. He didn't run, he glided, a predator shifting its weight. In a blur of motion, he was suddenly standing between me and the traffickers. He didn't even draw a weapon. He simply grabbed the lead trafficker by the throat and lifted him off the ground with one hand. The sound of the man's windpipe whistling for air was the only noise in the alley. "You were saying?" the stranger asked, his voice devoid of emotion. The trafficker's eyes widened. He looked at the insignia on the man's collar, the silver hawk of the high command. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His face went from greedy to terrified in a heartbeat. "See, Commander, Commander Valerius, we didn't know. We were just..." Rowan Valerius didn't let him finish. He slammed the man against the brick wall with a sickening thud and dropped him like a piece of trash. The other two traffickers didn't wait for a second invitation. They turned and bolted into the darkness, leaving their leader gasping for air on the pavement. I stayed huddled on the ground, trembling, my heart racing so fast I thought I might faint. I looked up at the man, Commander Rowan Valerius, the youngest and most feared commander in the Empire. I had heard the stories. He was a war hero, a butcher on the battlefield, a man who hated the nobility and the political games of the capital. He turned to look at me. Up close, he was devastating. His features were carved from granite, his jaw sharp, and a thin, faded scar ran across the bridge of his nose. But it was his eyes that held me, golden, intelligent, and currently filled with a mixture of amusement and suspicion. "Your husband, am I?" he asked. Stepping closer, I shrank back, the scent of cedarwood enveloping me. I realized the magnitude of my lie. I had just claimed to be the spouse of the most dangerous man in the military district. I expected him to be enraged. I expected him to hand me over to the guards or throw me back to the traffickers for my insolence. I stammered, my voice failing me. "I'm sorry. I was scared." Rowan stared at me for a long moment. He looked at my thin frame, my frayed clothes, and the sheer terror written across my face. He didn't look angry. Instead, he looked thoughtful. He reached out a hand. I flinched, closing my eyes, expecting a blow. But instead, I felt a large, warm hand gently grip my arm, pulling me to my feet. He didn't pull hard. He was surprisingly careful, as if he suspected I might break if he applied too much pressure. "You're an Amiga," he noted, his voice softening slightly. "And you're starving." "I'm fine," I lied, though my stomach chose that exact moment to let out a loud, betraying growl. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, not a kind smile, but one of intrigue. "Come with me." "Where?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Somewhere you won't be eaten by the locals," he replied. He led me to a sleek, black military vehicle parked at the end of the alley. He opened the door for me, and I slid into the leather interior, feeling completely out of place. As he climbed in beside me, the space suddenly felt very small. His scent filled the car, heavy and commanding, but for some reason, it didn't feel threatening. It felt like a shield. We drove in silence toward the center of the city, eventually arriving at a sprawling estate surrounded by high walls and armed guards. This was the commander's residence, a fortress of stone and glass that looked more like a military outpost than a home. Once inside, he led me to a dining room where a table was set with a simple but hearty meal, thick stew, fresh bread, and fruit. He didn't ask me to do anything, he simply pointed to the chair and told me to eat. I ate with a desperation that was almost animalistic, barely tasting the food as I shoved it into my mouth. Rowan sat opposite me, watching me with those golden eyes. He didn't judge me, he didn't comment on my lack of manners. He just watched. When I finally slowed down, leaning back in the chair with a sigh of contentment, he spoke. "Who are you? And why are you lying about being married to me?" I froze, the warmth of the food suddenly vanishing. I looked down at my lap, my fingers twisting in the fabric of my sweater. My name is Kael. I ran away from my home. My stepmother. She sold me to a man named Magnus Hale. I didn't tell him everything, but the raw pain in my voice seemed to convey enough. I told him about the escape, the fear, and the desperation that had led me to Oakhaven. I expected him to be bored or perhaps pitying. I didn't expect the look of cold understanding that crossed his face. The Everhart family, Rowan murmured. I know of them. Arrogant nobles who think their blood makes them gods. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his broad chest. You're lucky I was walking by, Kael. But you're also in a precarious position. If your stepmother is as powerful as you say, she'll eventually find you. And if the traffickers find you again, they won't be as lenient as I was. I know, I whispered. I don't have anywhere else to go. Rowan was silent for a long time. I could tell he was weighing something in his mind. He wasn't just thinking about me, he was thinking about himself. I have a problem of my own, he said eventually. My grandfather, General Valerius, and the political council in the capital are breathing down my neck. They want me to marry. They believe a stable domestic life will soften my image and secure alliances with the noble houses. I have spent my entire career avoiding their matchmaking schemes, but they are becoming insistent. They are threatening to limit my autonomy in the field if I don't produce a spouse. I looked at him, confused. Why was he telling me this? You lied today, Rowan continued, his eyes locking onto mine. You told those men that I was your husband. For a moment, it was a useful lie. Perhaps it could be a useful arrangement. My heart skipped a beat. An arrangement, a contract marriage, he explained. You need protection. You need a place to hide where no one, not your stepmother, not Magnus Hale, would dare to look. I need a spouse who is not a political pawn, someone who doesn't want my power or my money, and someone who will stay out of my way while providing the appearance of stability to the council. I stared at him, breathless. You want to marry me? For a contract. I am offering you a deal, Kael, he said, his voice turning businesslike. I will provide you with a home, food, protection, and the legal status of my spouse. In exchange, you will play the part when necessary. You will help me keep the political vultures at bay. When the contract is over, or when you are strong enough to stand on your own, we will find a way to dissolve it quietly. It was a dangerous proposal. I was essentially trading one form of dependence for another. But as I looked at Rowan, this terrifying, disciplined man who had seen my lowest moment and hadn't looked away in disgust, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Trust. It was a fragile, terrifying thing, but it was better than the alternative. Why me? I asked. You could find any Omega who would jump at the chance to marry the great commander. Rowan's expression softened just a fraction. Because you're not jumping. You're terrified, you're exhausted, and you have every reason to hate the world. I prefer people who know what it's like to fight for their lives. They are the only ones who are honest. I took a deep breath, the scent of cedarwood and smoke filling my lungs. It felt like a promise. I accept, I whispered. Rowan stood up and extended his hand. This time, when I took it, I didn't flinch. His hand was calloused and huge, swallowing mine completely, but his grip was firm and steady. Then it's settled, he said. Welcome to the Northern District, Kael. Try not to get yourself kidnapped again. As he led me toward the guest quarters, I felt the weight of the world shift. I was still a fugitive, and I was now bound to a man who was feared by an entire empire. But as I looked at the broad set of Rowan's shoulders, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into a cage. I was walking into a fortress. The first few weeks in the commander's residence were spent in a state of suspended animation. I lived in a constant, low-level vibration of anxiety, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I had spent 19 years learning that kindness was a lure, a thin veil used by predators to make their prey complacent. I expected Rowan to eventually demand payment for his protection, not in money, but in the way Magnus Hale would have demanded it. I expected the contract to be a formality, a legal shield for a different kind of ownership. But Rowan Valerius was a man of his word, and his word was as immutable as the mountains surrounding Oakhaven. He provided me with a suite of rooms that were larger and warmer than any I had ever occupied. The bed was a sea of charcoal gray linens and heavy wool blankets that smelled faintly of hemp, cedarwood, and smoke. For the first few nights, I couldn't sleep. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic sound of the guards patrolling the perimeter, and the distant howl of the wind. I felt like an intruder in my own life. The change began with the small things. In the Everhart mansion, meals were silent affairs, fraught with the tension of Vivienne's judgment. If I dropped a fork, I was reminded of my incompetence. If I asked for seconds, I was called greedy. But in the military residence, food was treated as fuel and comfort. Rowan didn't expect me to serve him. In fact, he seemed almost offended when I tried to clear the table. "Sit down, Kael," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "You're not a servant here. You're a member of this household. Act like it." He began to cook for me. It wasn't the elaborate, decadent cuisine of the capital, but it was honest. Hearty stews, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread that filled the house with a scent of warmth and security. I remember the first time he made me a bowl of porridge with honey and cinnamon on a morning when the frost had turned the windows opaque. He set it before me without a word, his golden eyes scanning my face as if checking for signs of lingering hunger. I remember looking at the steam rising from the bowl and feeling a sudden, violent surge of emotion in my chest. It was such a simple gesture, a bowl of porridge, but it was the first time in years that someone had provided for me without expecting something in return. I didn't know how to handle it. I felt a lump form in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Is it too hot?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's, thank you." He didn't make a big deal of it. He simply nodded and went back to reading his military reports. But the atmosphere between us shifted. The silence was no longer a void. It was becoming a bridge. As the months passed, Rowan noticed the hollow spaces in my education. He found me in the residence's library, tracing the spines of books I had been forbidden to read in the capital. Vivienne had wanted me ignorant. She believed the mindless amiga was an obedient one. When Rowan saw me struggling with a complex text on political economy, he didn't mock me. He didn't tell me it was too difficult for someone like me. Instead, he sat down beside me. "The third chapter is the most important," he said, pointing to a section on resource management. "If you understand how the empire allocates its grain, you understand why the border cities are neglected." "Do you want me to explain it?" I looked at him, startled. You do that." "I have no interest in a spouse who can't hold a conversation," he replied, though there was a glint of something soft in his eyes. "And you have a mind that's far too sharp to be left to rust, Kael." He became my tutor, my mentor, and my anchor. He pushed me to study, to question, and to think critically about the world that had tried to crush me. Under his guidance, the fog of my childhood trauma began to lift, replaced by a hunger for knowledge that felt like a fire in my veins. But the most unexpected part of our arrangement was the training. One afternoon, Rowan led me to the training courtyard. The air was crisp, and the sound of soldiers sparring echoed off the stone walls. I assumed he wanted me to watch, but instead he handed me a wooden training sword. "I don't know how to fight," I said, staring at the weapon as if it were a venomous snake. "That's why we're here," Rowan replied. "The world is full of people like Vivienne and Magnus Hale. They rely on the fact that omegas are taught to be fragile. I want you to stop being fragile." The first few weeks were grueling. I was weak, my coordination poor, and my muscles screamed in protest after every session. I fell. I was bruised. I cried out of sheer frustration when I couldn't execute a simple parry. But Rowan never yelled. He never told me to get up because I was an omega. He told me to get up because I was a survivor. He would stand behind me, his large hand guiding my wrist, his chest a warm wall against my back. The scent of cedarwood and smoke would envelop me, grounding me when the panic of failure threatened to overwhelm me. "Balance," he would murmur in my ear, his voice vibrating through my spine. "Don't fight the force of the blow. Redirect it. Use their strength against them." Slowly, the transformation began. The softness of my frame didn't vanish, but it tightened. My movements became more fluid, my gaze more steady. I learned how to strike, how to dodge, and how to hold my ground. More importantly, I learned that my body was not just a piece of property to be sold or a vessel for someone else's heir. It was a weapon. It was mine. As I grew stronger physically, I grew bolder emotionally. I began to speak my mind, to argue with Rowan about the text we read, to actually laugh for the first time in years. I found myself seeking him out, not out of fear, but out of a desperate, aching need for his presence. I began to notice the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. The way his golden eyes would soften, the way his jaw would relax, the way he would linger just a second too long when he handed me a book. I realized that the contract was no longer the only thing holding us together. There was a thread of something far more dangerous and beautiful weaving itself between us. Then came the heat. I had always dreaded my heat cycles. In the Everhart mansion, they were a time of vulnerability and shame. I would be locked in my room, left with nothing but suppressants that made me feel sick and disconnected from my own body. I remember the feeling of being a prisoner to my own biology, the desperate, clawing need for an alpha that felt like a betrayal of my own will. As my cycle approached, the air in the residence began to change. My scent snow, jasmine, and vanilla intensified, becoming heavy and sweet, filling the corridors like a siren's song. I could tell Rowan felt it. He became more distant, his movements stiffer. His scent of cedarwood becoming sharper, more aggressive. The night had hit. I was in my room, shivering under the blankets, my skin feeling too tight for my body. The fever burned through me, a molten wave of desire and desperation that made me sob into my pillow. I wanted him. I wanted the man who had taught me how to fight, the man who had fed me when I was starving, the man who looked at me and saw a person instead of a prize. But I was terrified. I was terrified that if he came to me now, it would change everything. I was terrified that the contract would vanish, and I would once again be an omega defined by my need for an alpha. There was a knock at the door. Kael? Rowan's voice was strained, rough with a hunger that mirrored my own. I could smell him through the wood. The smoke was thick, the cedar wood overpowering. He was fighting himself. Go away, I gasped, though every fiber of my being was screaming for him to enter. Please, just go away. I can smell you, Kael, he groaned, his voice sounding like it was being torn from his throat. I know you're suffering. I'm fine, I lied, my voice breaking into a whimper. The door opened slowly. Rowan stood in the threshold, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. He looked like a storm personified. His eyes were glowing, his pupils blown wide, and his chest was heaving. He looked terrifying. He looked like the butcher the world feared. But as he looked at me shaking, flushed, and desperate, the aggression in his scent shifted. It didn't become predatory, it became protective. He didn't lunge at me. He didn't take advantage of my vulnerability. Instead, he walked to the bed and sat on the edge, keeping a careful distance. I am not going to touch you, he said, his voice low and steady, though I could hear the effort it took to maintain that control. Not unless you ask me to. Not unless you are sure. I looked at him, tears streaming down my cheeks. Why? Because you spent your whole life being told that your body belongs to whoever has the most power. Rowan replied, his gaze unwavering. I will not be another man who takes what isn't freely given. You are not a prize, Kael. You are my husband, even if it's only on paper. And that means your consent is the only thing that matters. I let out a broken sob and lunged forward, wrapping my arms around his neck, burying my face in the crook of his shoulder. I breathed him in the smoke, the wood, the sheer, overwhelming strength of him. Rowan stiffened for a moment, his breath hitching, before his arms wrapped around me with a fierce, possessive tenderness. He didn't push me toward the pillows. He didn't try to claim me. He simply held me. For the next 3 days, Rowan stayed by my side. He didn't cross the boundary of our contract, but he provided everything I needed. He brought me cool cloths for my fever, water to keep me hydrated, and a presence that felt like a fortress around my soul. He talked to me not about politics or training, but about his childhood, about the loneliness of being a prodigy in a military family, about the weight of the expectations he carried. He treated my heat not as an opportunity for pleasure, but as a moment of healing. He proved to me, over and over again, that protection did not need to be paired with cruelty. He showed me that an alpha could be powerful without being a predator. When the fever finally broke and the world stopped spinning, I woke up to find him asleep in a chair beside my bed, his hands still resting on the mattress just inches from mine. I looked at him, this man who had every reason to be cold and every power to be cruel, and I realized that I was no longer in love with the idea of safety. I was in love with him. I reached out and gently touched his hand. Rowan stirred, his golden eyes fluttering open. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the commander. I saw Rowan. Are you okay? He whispered. I am, I said, and for the first time in my life, I meant it. I'm finally okay. He leaned forward and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. It wasn't a claim. It wasn't a mark. It was a promise. In the months that followed, we stopped pretending the marriage was just a contract. We didn't sign new papers, and we didn't make a grand announcement. But the air between us had changed. We became a unit. We shared meals, we shared books, and we shared a quiet, profound intimacy that grew in the spaces between our words. I continued my studies, delving deeper into the laws of inheritance and the corporate structures of the capital. Rowan encouraged me, providing me with resources and connections that would have been unthinkable for an Omega. He didn't just want me to be a spouse, he wanted me to be a peer. I began to spend more time in the training yard, not just learning to defend myself, but learning to lead. I started helping the newer recruits, teaching them the reader action techniques Rowan had taught me. I saw the way the soldiers looked at me, not with the pity they had shown the broken Omega, but with a budding respect. I looked in the mirror one morning and barely recognized the person staring back. The gaunt, hollow-eyed boy who had fled the Everhart mansion was gone. In his place was a young man with clear eyes, strong shoulders, and a steady hand. My scent of snow, jasmine, and vanilla had changed, too. It was no longer a fragile, sweet thing, but something richer, layered with the confidence of someone who knew their own worth. I felt a sense of peace I had never known, a feeling of being truly home. But deep down, in the quietest part of my heart, I knew that this peace was a luxury. I knew that Vivienne Everhart was still out there, and that the ghosts of my past were not yet laid to rest. I didn't know when the storm would return, but as I looked at Rowan, who was currently arguing with the map of the border territories in the study, I knew I wouldn't be facing it alone. I was no longer the Omega waiting to be saved. I was a partner. I was a fighter. And I was ready for whatever was coming. Because for the first time in my life, I had something worth fighting for. Peace, I discovered, is not a permanent state. It is a fragile truce with the world. For a year, I lived in a dream of my own making. In the Northern Military District, I had built a life out of the ruins of my childhood. I was no longer the shivering boy in the attic. I was a student of law and economics, a trained combatant, and the husband of a man who loved me with a quiet, unwavering intensity. My days were measured in the rhythm of my studies and the warmth of Rowan's presence. We had reached a point of intimacy that transcended the contract. The physical bond had evolved naturally, a slow burn that culminated in a night of mutual surrender that had rewritten the map of my soul. Rowan didn't just claim me, he cherished me. He treated my body as a sanctuary, and in return, I gave him the only thing I had left: my absolute, unconditional trust. But the capital is a place that never forgets a debt. And Vivienne Everhart was a woman who viewed the world as a ledger of losses and gains. The first sign that the truce was over arrived in the form of a formal letter, embossed with the gold seal of the Everhart estate. I remember the day it arrived. The sun was setting over the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Rowan had been in a meeting with his generals, and I was in the library, sketching notes on corporate inheritance laws. When I opened the envelope, I expected threats. I expected a demand for my return, or a cold reminder of the debts Vivienne claimed I owed. Instead, I found a letter dripping with a sickening, artificial sweetness. "My dearest Kael," it began, "the house has been so empty without you. Your father would be heartbroken to know the distance between us. We have realized the great mistake we made in our grief, and we long to welcome you home as the beloved son you have always been. Please, return to us. There are family matters and a legacy that only you can resolve." I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. The handwriting was elegant, the tone maternal, but the words felt like spiders crawling across my skin. I knew Vivienne. She didn't feel regret. She felt a need. "What is it?" Rowan asked, stepping into the library. He had shed his military jacket, his white shirt rolled up at the elbows, exposing the corded muscle of his forearms. He sensed the shift in my scent immediately. The jasmine had turned sharp, laced with the acrid tang of anxiety. I handed him the letter. He read it in silence, his golden eyes narrowing into slits. "She doesn't want you, Kael," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She wants something you have." I didn't understand what he meant until a week later, when a contact I had established in the capital, a disgraced former lawyer for the Everhart firm, sent me a set of encrypted documents. As I pored over the files, the truth unfolded like a horror story. My father had not left the company to Vivienne or Elliot, in a secret codicil to his will, hidden within a trust that only matured on my 19th birthday. He had designated me as the primary shareholder of the Everhart conglomerate. I wasn't just an heir, I was the legal owner of the majority of the family's wealth and power. Vivienne had known. She had spent years suppressing the information, isolating me, and treating me like a servant to ensure I never discovered the truth. She had planned to keep me under her thumb until she could find a way to legally transfer the shares to Elliot or herself. But her gambling debts and failed business ventures had accelerated her timeline. She had tried to sell me to Magnus Hale, not just to get money, but to remove me from the board entirely, to put me in a place where I would be too broken to ever claim my birthright. And then, she had discovered that I hadn't just survived. I had married Commander Rowan Valerius. The realization was a lightning strike. I wasn't a beloved son. I was a gold mine. As soon as the news of my marriage and my survival hit the capital's social circles, the narrative shifted. Vivienne didn't admit to selling me. Instead, she launched a sophisticated smear campaign. The tabloids began to run stories about the ungrateful Omega of Everhart, claiming that I had abandoned my family in their time of grief to seduce a powerful military commander for money and status. They painted me as a manipulator, a cold-hearted youth who had played on Rowan's loneliness to secure a life of luxury. Elliot, ever the spoiled parasite, played the role of the heartbroken brother, giving interviews about how he had tried to save Kael from his own ambition. I watched the reports from the safety of the North, feeling a strange mixture of rage and amusement. They were trying to use the very weapons they had used against me: shame, isolation, and lies. But they didn't realize that I was no longer the boy who believed their lies. "They're trying to bait you," Rowan told me one evening. We were standing on the balcony of the residence, the cold wind whipping through our hair. He had his arm around my waist, pulling me close against the chill. "They want you to react. They want you to come back to the capital as a supplicant, begging for forgiveness, so they can trap you and force you to sign over those shares." "I'm not afraid of them," I said, though my voice trembled slightly. I know you're not, he replied, kissing the top of my head. But fear is a tool. They're using it to guide you. The question is, Kael, what do you want? I looked out over the mountains, thinking of the years of silence, the scrubbing of floors, the terror of the night I ran. I thought of my father, whose kindness had been my only light in a dark world. And then I thought of the reports I had received about his death. The official record said it had been a sudden heart failure, that the disgraced lawyer had sent me something else, a medical report from the night he died, noting an unusual concentration of a rare, undetectable toxin in his bloodstream, a toxin that was often used in the underworld to mimic natural cardiac arrest. The air in my lungs suddenly felt like ice. My father hadn't just died. He had been murdered. The grief I had suppressed for 3 years erupted in a single violent wave. It wasn't a quiet sadness, it was a scorching, all-consuming rage. I felt the jasmine of my scent flare, turning into something potent and predatory. I turned to Rowan, my eyes burning. I don't want to hide anymore, Kael. I'm not going back as a son, and I'm not going back as a husband who needs protection, I said, my voice steady and cold. I'm going back as the owner of the Everhart company. I'm going back to take everything they stole from me, and I'm going back to make them pay for what they did to my father. Rowan didn't hesitate. He didn't tell me it was too dangerous, or that I was being impulsive. He simply tightened his grip on me, his golden eyes reflecting the fire in mine. Then we go together, he said, and we burn their world to the ground. The preparation for our return was methodical. For a month, Rowan and I worked in tandem, while he coordinated with his military contacts to ensure we had a secure base of operations in the capital. I worked with the lawyer to build a legal fortress around my inheritance. I studied the corporate bylaws, the tax loopholes, and the evidence of Vivienne's embezzlement. I didn't just want to reclaim my shares. I wanted to dismantle her life piece by piece. The physical transformation was the final step. I spent hours in the gym, pushing my body to its limits, turning the lean muscle Rowan had helped me build into something more defined. I traded my oversized sweaters and faded linens for tailored suits of midnight blue and charcoal gray. I learned how to walk with the confidence of a man who owned the room, how to hold a gaze without flinching, and how to use my scent as a weapon of dominance rather than a plea for mercy. When we finally boarded the transport back to the capital, I felt as though I were stepping into a different skin. I was no longer the prey. I was the hunter. Returning to the capital was like entering a den of vipers. The city was just as gilded and superficial as I remembered, but it felt smaller now. As we drove through the streets in Rowan's armored vehicle, I saw the billboards and the digital screens flashing news of the Everhart scandal. I saw the faces of the people who had looked down on me, the people who had whispered about my fall from grace. We didn't go to the Everhart mansion first. Instead, we went to the corporate headquarters. The boardroom was filled with the board of directors, men and women, who had served my father for decades, but had folded the moment Vivienne took power. They were arguing about the quarterly dividends. When the doors swung open, I walked in first, my footsteps echoing on the polished marble. I was wearing a sharp, silver-gray suit that complemented my hair, my expression a mask of cold indifference. Rowan followed behind me, his presence a towering shadow of military power that silenced the room instantly. The silence was absolute. Every eye in the room was on me. Some looked confused, some looked horrified, and some looked as if they had seen a ghost. "Who are you?" one of the directors asked, his voice trembling. I didn't answer him. Instead, I walked to the head of the table, the chair that had belonged to my father, and sat down. I leaned back, crossing my legs, and looked at them with a slow, predatory smile. "My name is Kael Everhart," I said, my voice echoing with the confidence I had spent a year forging. "And I believe you're sitting in my company." I produced the legal documents, the trust papers, and the verified shares. I watched as the color drained from their faces. I watched as the realization hit them that the broken Amiga had returned as their boss. But the real victory was yet to come. That evening, I returned to the Everhart mansion. I didn't enter through the servants' entrance this time. I walked through the front doors, the heavy oak swinging open, as if the house itself were trembling in anticipation. Vivienne was in the drawing room, sipping tea and chatting with Elliot. They both looked up as I entered, their expressions shifting from shock to a desperate, fake warmth and a heartbeat. "Kael, my darling boy," Vivienne cried, rising from her seat and rushing toward me with open arms. "We were so worried. We knew you'd come home eventually. Come, let me hold you." I stepped back, avoiding her touch as if she were a plague. The look of confusion on her face was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice like a blade. "I can still smell the lilies on you, Vivienne. They smell like death." The mask slipped. The fake warmth vanished, replaced by a flicker of the cruelty I remembered. "How dare you speak to me in such a tone? You are a guest in this house. This isn't your house," I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave. "I checked the deeds this morning. The mansion is tied to the primary shares of the company, which means this house, the furniture you're sitting on, and the very clothes on your back belong to me. Elliot stood up, his face twisted in rage. You can't do this. You're just a pathetic little amiga who ran away like a coward. You seduced Commander Valerius to get back here. Rowan stepped forward, his scent of cedarwood and smoke exploding in the room, and Alpha's dominance that crashed over Elliot like a tidal wave. Elliot gasped, his knees buckling as he collapsed back into his chair, unable to breathe under the pressure of Rowan's aura. Careful, boy, Rowan murmured, his golden eyes glowing. You're speaking to my husband, and I don't like it when people insult my husband. Vivienne looked between us, her eyes darting, her mind clearly racing to find a new angle. Kael, please, we can resolve this. We are family. Whatever happened in the past was a misunderstanding. I reached into my folder and pulled out the medical report regarding my father's death. I tossed it onto the coffee table between us. My father didn't have a heart attack, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. He was poisoned, and I think we both know who provided the toxin. The color drained from Vivienne's face. She didn't move. She didn't speak. For the first time in her life, she looked truly terrified. I didn't come back for the money, Vivienne, I whispered, leaning in close so she could smell the jasmine and the coldness of my resolve. I came back to watch you lose everything. Every cent, every title, every shred of dignity. I am going to strip you bare, and then I am going to hand you over to the authorities. I looked at the woman who had tried to break me, and I felt nothing. No hate, no anger, just a profound sense of closure. She had tried to sell me like property, but in doing so, she had taught me how to survive. She had given me the desperation that led me to Rowan, and the strength that led me back to myself. As the guards I had brought with me stepped forward to escort her and Elliot out of the house, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I looked up at Rowan, and he smiled a real, genuine smile. You did it, he said. We did it. I corrected him. I looked around the cold, opulent room and realized that for the first time, the scent of lilies was gone. In its place was the smell of cedarwood, smoke, and the fresh, clean air of a new beginning. But as I stood there, the victor of a war one had once been too afraid to fight, a sudden, strange sensation washed over me. A flutter in my stomach, a wave of nausea, and a sudden, overwhelming scent of sweetness that seemed to emanate from my own skin. I froze, my hand instinctively moving to my stomach. I looked at Rowan, and his eyes widened, his nostrils flaring as he caught the change in my scent. Kael, he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of shock and wonder. I didn't have the words to tell him yet, but I knew. The nightmare I had had years ago, the gilded prison, and the child had been a warning. But this was different. This wasn't a curse, it was a miracle. I was pregnant, and as I looked at the ruins of the Everhart family, I realized that my revenge was complete. Now, it was time to build something that would actually last. The weeks following the collapse of Vivienne's empire were a strange, suspended reality. I had spent so long focusing on the destination, the moment of reclamation, that I hadn't fully considered what it would feel like to actually arrive. I was now the head of the Everhart conglomerate, the legal owner of the mansion, and the most talked about amiga in the empire. But as I stood in the center of my father's old study, the silence of the room felt heavy. The victory was absolute, yet the ghost of the past didn't vanish simply because I had one. And then there was the life growing inside me. Pregnancy for an amiga is often described as a time of softness and surrender, but for me, it felt like a new kind of war. My body, which I had spent a year hardening into a weapon, was now shifting again. The nausea was a constant companion, a lingering reminder of my vulnerability. And my scent, once a sharp, confident blend of jasmine and vanilla, had deepened into something creamier, more primal. Rowan became a man possessed. He didn't just protect me, he hovered. He treated me as if I were made of the finest, most fragile porcelain, a tendency that would have irritated me if it weren't for the way his golden eyes looked at me with a reverence that bordered on worship. He would wake up in the middle of the night just to place a hand on my stomach, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. I can feel them, he whispered one rainy afternoon, his voice thick with emotion. They're strong, Kael. Just like you. I leaned back against the pillows, watching him. I realized then that Rowan's love had not just saved me from Vivienne. It had saved me from the coldness I had cultivated to survive. He had taught me that strength didn't have to mean isolation. But while my private life was a sanctuary, the public sphere remained a battlefield. Vivienne and Elliot had been arrested, but the legal process was a slow, grinding machine. Vivienne, ever the manipulator, attempted to use her remaining connections to paint herself as a victim of a delusional son and a military tyrant. She claimed the evidence of the poisoning had been fabricated by Rowan to seize the Everhart assets. The capital's nobility, always fond of a scandal and terrified of military overreach, began to whisper. Then came Magnus Hale. Magnus had not been forgotten. He had been humiliated when the prize he had paid for vanished, and he had been further enraged when he discovered that I was now the most powerful businessman in the region. He didn't want me for love or even for a spouse anymore. He wanted me as a trophy of revenge. He began buying up the debt of my smaller suppliers, attempting to choke the Everhart conglomerate from the outside. He requested a meeting. I knew it was a trap, but I also knew that as long as Magnus Hale existed as a threat, my child would never be truly safe. "I'll go," I told Rowan. "But I'm not going as a victim." Rowan had tried to forbid it, his alpha instinct screaming at the thought of me in a room with a man like Magnus. But I reminded him of the lessons he had taught me. I reminded him that I was no longer a boy who could be bought. The meeting took place in a sterile, high-rise office in the business district. Magnus Hale looked every bit the decaying predator he was, his skin like parchment, his eyes cold and greedy. He sat behind a desk of obsidian, smelling of old musk and arrogance. "You've grown, Kael," Magnus sneered, his gaze lingering on my stomach. "A bit more rounded than when I last saw you." I must congratulate Commander Valerius. He certainly knows how to utilize an Omega's primary function. I didn't flinch. I didn't let my scent flare in anger. I simply sat down, crossed my legs, and placed a folder on his desk. "I didn't come here to discuss my functions, Magnus," I said, my voice cold and precise. "I came to discuss your insolvency." Magnus laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Insolvency? I am one of the wealthiest men in the Empire." "You were," I corrected, "until I spent the last 3 weeks quietly buying every single one of your outstanding loans from the banks in the South. You've been leveraging your assets to maintain an image of wealth, but your actual liquidity is non-existent. As of 10 o'clock this morning, I am your primary creditor." The laugh died in his throat. The color drained from his face as he opened the folder. I watched the moment the realization hit him, the moment he realized that the boy he had tried to buy had just bought him. You can't," he stammered. "I can," I replied, leaning forward. "And I intend to call in every single debt. Immediately. You will lose your estates, your shares, and your reputation. You will be left with nothing but the clothes on your back and the memory of the Omega you underestimated." I stood up, the movement fluid and dominant. "I'm not my father, Magnus. He was a gentleman. I am a man who knows exactly what it costs to be broken, and I find the price of your ruin to be a bargain." As I walked out of the office, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even known I was carrying. It wasn't just about the money or the power. It was about the final severance of the chain. Magnus Hale was no longer a monster in my nightmares. He was just a pathetic, bankrupt old man. However, the final challenge was not financial, but political. Rowan's enemies in the High Council saw my pregnancy and my sudden rise to power as an opportunity. They viewed the alliance between the Empire's most feared commander and its most powerful corporate heir as a threat to the established order. They began a campaign to strip Rowan of his command, citing conflicts of interest and claiming that his judgment was clouded by his domestic attachments. They tried to use me as the lever to pull him down. They sent emissaries to me, offering me protection and guidance if I would only testify that Rowan had coerced me into the marriage for financial gain. I met them in the grand ballroom of the Everhart mansion, a space that had once been my prison and was now my fortress. I invited the council members, the nobility, and the press. I wanted the whole world to see. I stood on the dais, Rowan standing a half step behind me. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. His presence was the anchor that allowed me to soar. For years, I was told that Omegas are tools. I began, my voice carrying through the silent room. I was told that our value lies in our obedience, our fertility, and our ability to be owned. I was sold by my own family. I was hunted by traffickers. I was treated as a piece of property to be traded for gambling debts. A murmur ran through the crowd. The nobility shifted uncomfortably. But I found a man who saw me not as a tool, but as a person. I continued, glancing back at Rowan. A man who taught me that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to protect it. You call our marriage a conflict of interest. I call it a partnership. You call my pregnancy a weakness. I call it the future of this empire. I looked directly at the head of the council, a man whose greed was as legendary as his hypocrisy. You think you can use me to destroy Rowan? You forget that I own the companies that supply your munitions. I own the land your estates are built on. And I have the evidence of every single one of your bribes to the border governors. I paused, a slow smile spreading across my lips. If you attempt to remove Commander Valerius from his post, I will not only bankrupt you, I will ensure that every secret you've buried is screamed from the rooftops of the capital. Rowan is the sword of this empire, but I am the hand that holds the purse together. We are not a conflict of interest. We are the new order. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the silence of total surrender. One by one, the council members bowed their heads. The political game was over. I had not just won the board, I had flipped the table. The final act of my journey took place in a courtroom. 6 months later, Vivienne and Elliot stood in the dock, stripped of their finery and their pride. The evidence against Vivienne was overwhelming: the medical records, the financial trails of the poison, and the testimony of the disgraced lawyer. As the judge read the sentence, life imprisonment for the murder of her husband and fraud, Vivienne looked at me. For a moment, the mask of the noble woman was gone, and I saw the hollow, terrified woman beneath. "Please, Kael," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am your mother. Have mercy." I looked at her, and I searched my heart for a flicker of the boy who had once scrubbed her floors. The boy who had hoped for her love. I found nothing. There was no hate left, only a vast, empty space where a family should have been. "You aren't my mother," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You were just the person who taught me how to survive you." I turned and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The end of the story didn't happen in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in a quiet room in the northern military district. The winter had returned, and the mountains were draped in a heavy, shimmering blanket of snow. Inside the residence, the air was warm, smelling of cedarwood, smoke, and the sweet, milky scent of a newborn. I lay in bed, exhausted and glowing, holding a small, warm bundle against my chest. He had Rowan's dark hair and my gray eyes that were currently blinking up at me with a curiosity that felt like a miracle. Rowan was beside me, his large hand cradling the baby's tiny back. He looked at the child, then at me, and the expression on his face was one of such profound love that it brought tears to my eyes. "What should we name him?" Rowan whispered. I looked at my son, the child who had once been a symbol of my nightmare, but was now the centerpiece of my dream. I thought of my father, the man whose gentleness had been my first light. "Leo," I said, "after the lion, because he will never have to be afraid." I looked around the room at the books we had read together, the training sword leaning against the wall, and the man who had become my home. I had spent 19 years believing that blood was the only thing that defined a family, and then I had spent a year learning that blood means nothing when love is absent. I had reclaimed my name. I had reclaimed my wealth. I had reclaimed my dignity. But the greatest reclamation of all had been my own soul. I was no longer the Omega waiting to be saved. I was no longer the prey. I was a husband, a father, and a leader. I was the sovereign of my own life. As the snow fell softly outside the window, burying the scars of the world in white, I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, knowing that for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. The gilded cage was gone. The fortress was mine, and within its walls, we were finally, irrevocably free.